Our story comes from two different books, and the first part of the story comes from a book called I Saw God's Hand. Elwyn Martin, 25 years old, had just given his heart to Jesus. In fact, he had not just given his heart to Jesus, he had changed his life completely. Elwyn was a sawmiller. He worked cutting lumber, and he was also an engineer and a mechanic, and he had learned about Jesus at a camp meeting in Australia where he lived. He had learned about Jesus who loved him, and he had learned that Jesus has a special day of the week that he wants us to show our love back by keeping it special. What day of the week is that? Sabbath. And so he decided, I'm not going to work on Sabbath, and he couldn't continue on with his job. His employer said, you have to work on Sabbath. I'm not going to do it. So he lost his job, and he thought, well, I guess I'm going to go back to school. I never went to college, but I want to do something for God. I'm going to apply to college. And he applied to the Missionary College in Australia. And they told him, nope, sorry, we're not going to accept you, Elwyn. Why not? I can do the work. Please, I'll work. I have the money to pay. Nope, we can't take you. We can't take you. And they kept telling him no until finally he said, could I just please have a meeting with the principal, the dean of the college, just to talk to him and see why they won't let me in? So the dean let Elwyn into his office, and he said, I'm sorry, sir. I understand you've applied, and we have many people applying. And the problem is that we have not enough dorms, not enough sleeping buildings for people to stay in, so we're not allowed to take any more students. Oh, man, said Owen, I really wanted to. No, I'm sorry, you can't. However, well, the only one that I can make an exception for, I've got a letter that I received here, comes from the president, and I don't really know what it says, but it said there was an exception. Let me look here. It said we could have, it says we could only make one exception if we got a student applying named Elwyn Martin. And Elwyn said, that's my name. Really? Well, who do you know? You know the president of the conference? No, sir, I've never met him. Well, you wrote a letter, said you can get in. Elwyn got into college. He never figured out how that letter got written for him, but he got right into that college. He started studying to be a missionary. He also started dating a girl named Alma. And they were in love and they were happy, but they knew that they'd only met a few months before. It was going to take a while for them to get to know each other better, and maybe someday they could get married. But then Elwyn got a letter from the mission board. He had sent an application saying, I would love to be a missionary, send me anywhere. And they said, we could use a missionary to the Solomon Islands. And Elwyn said, sign me up! And then he looked at the bottom of the letter and it said, and in order to go to the Solomon Islands, you must be married. And by the way, you're leaving in a month. Elwyn took the letter with him, and he went to Alma, and he said, I have something you need to read. And Alma read the letter, and she said, yes! And 3 weeks later, they were married. And a day after they were married, they were on a boat heading to the Solomon Islands. When they got to Solomon Islands, Elwyn and Alma were assigned to work at the school in Batuna. Batuna was a mission school there on the Solomon Islands. It was kind of the headquarters for the mission work in that area. And Elwyn was assigned as a sawmiller, an engineer, just kind of a jack of all trades. He helped wherever somebody needed help with their hands, he was good with his hands. One project he was involved with helping with was building fences for the garden. Do you guys have gardens? Yes? How many of you have an animal that comes in and eats things out of your garden? It might be little, it might be kind of middle-sized, it might be big like a deer. Yeah? You can put your hands down. Bunnies have to get in there. But you know what they had to build fences for in the Solomon Islands? Pigs. Wild pigs that would go through the jungle, and they would love the produce that would grow under the ground in those gardens. And the gardens were very important. The gardens were the source of income for people. You didn't really have a lot of other job opportunities, but you could grow your food, so you have food to eat, and you could sell food, or you could even pay with food. Often you would, if somebody needed to sell you something, if you wanted to buy something from someone, you would say, all right, I would like to have that tool you have. I will give you 15 sweet potatoes for it. And they'd make the trade. So what your garden produced was actually like money. So to have pigs coming around eating your produce was like having pigs robbing your bank. You all had piggy banks? These were pigs robbing the banks. But if you built fences, they wouldn't get in. Well, you'd think so, but these pigs are smart. Pigs are actually very intelligent animals. Josiah, am I correct? Pigs have high intelligence. And so these pigs would figure out how to get in there. They would find ways to break it down. They'd work together to find the weakest spot and knock it over. And sure enough, they would knock these fences down. So then Elwyn was constantly having to rebuild the fences. Now I told you all that to tell you about some amazing miracle that happened with the garden fences. At the school in Batuna, there was a student named Likaveki. Oh, you guys realize, of course, that people who are born and live in other parts of the world aren't going to have names that sound normal to you, right? Just like your names probably wouldn't sound normal to someone who lives in another part of the world. So Likaveki is his name. He was a student, and he was a really good student. He loved God already. He loved what he had learned about God at the mission school, and he was kind of helping out to be in control and charge of supervising the gardens. And he came one day and he told Elwyn, Mr. Elwyn, I need to make an announcement. I need to make an announcement, Mr. Elwyn. And, okay, to who? To all the students. Gather all students, I make an announcement. All right, so they gathered all the students, and Likaveki stood up. And he said, you have robbed God. That's quite an opening statement for an announcement. And all the students looked, and Elwyn thought, oh my goodness, what is he doing? And then Likaveki said, I went out to gardens this morning. All fences broken down. All the fences broken down. And the reason is, and Elwyn thought, oh, he's going to say the reason is I don't build good fences. No, he said, the reason is you are not paying tithe on your garden. You know what tithe is? Tithe is, if you get 10 pennies, you put 1 penny aside for God. If you get $10, you put $1 aside for God. 1 out of every 10 you set aside for God. And I told you the gardens were their money too, right? So the way that the people in the Solomon Islands paid tithe was they would set aside 1 out of every 10 sweet potatoes, 1 out of every 10 bunches of bananas, 1 out of every 10 taro roots. And then they would give that to help support the missionaries who were working there for them. Well, Likaveki was right on. When he said, you are not paying tithe on your gardens, students started to stand up and they started to confess. I admit I have not paid tithe on my garden. I admit I have not paid tithe on my garden. And everyone started confessing they had not been paying tithe. Likaveki said, we are going to fix the problem. We are going to go out and plant gardens. Because the Bible says, if you rob God, that is bad. But if you pay tithe, God says, try me now in this, I will pour out blessings from heaven. Oh, Elwyn thought, this is great, that's great, this is a wonderful lesson on paying tithe. This is so good. But then Likaveki said something that Elwyn was not ready for. And we are going to try God in this. We will plant the gardens and build no fences. Oh, what? Likaveki, are you working for the pigs, man? Yeah, the pigs are just going to come rampaging through the gardens. No fences, thought Elwyn? Yeah, Likaveki, come over here, come over. What do you mean no fences? How can you not have fences? Well, Mr. Elwyn, the Bible says, try me now in this, I will pour out blessings when you pay the tithe. And nowhere in that verses does it say, build fences first. It says, I will rebuke the destroyer, not the fences. The destroyer was definitely the pigs. The pigs were destroying the gardens. Likaveki had decided that's what the Bible meant, and that's what he was going to do. And Elwyn was absolutely convinced it was not going to work. But what could he do? He couldn't stand up and say, no, let's not trust God. Stop trusting God so much. No, he was supposed to be there as a missionary, encouraging them to trust God. But the problem he was running into was it seemed like the people he was being a missionary to had more faith than he did. Likaveki led 10 students, the 10 who had stood up and confessed. He said, we are building one big garden out in the jungle, away from all the other gardens. We will build our garden, no fences. And they went out and they worked on it. And Elwyn didn't have anything to do with it. He didn't need to go out there. There was no fences to build. He didn't do anything with it until 6 months later, Likaveki came back and said, Mr. Elwyn, you come see the garden. Okay, thought, I've been curious what's going to happen. They got out there. They walked for a couple miles. And all the way there, on every little jungle trail that they followed, there were hoof prints. Hoof prints of pigs. They used the trails. They're smart. Why make your own trail when there's established trails from the human feet? And they'd go out there and there was hoof prints all over the place. Oh my God, look at this, like a highway of pigs all heading to this unguarded garden. That's ridiculous. I just don't see why. What a waste of 6 months. They got there, and Elwyn stepped out from the garden into this clearing that they had hacked out from the jungle, and there was the most amazing garden. He said that he could see sweet potatoes busting up out of the ground. They were so big. That there were bananas longer than his arm that were going. He'd never seen fruits and vegetables this big. And it was just luscious. There was just so much food there. And then Likaveki said, come see, Mr. Elwyn, come see. And he led him over to the edge of the garden. and they walked the perimeter of the garden. You could tell where the edge of the garden was because that's where all the pig hoof prints ended. There were pig hoof prints all around the garden, like the pigs have been running in circles around it, but none of them have come into the garden at all. And Likaveki said, that's because he rebuked the destroyer. He not dare go any further. Not a single plant eaten in that garden. And that's when Elwyn started to realize, oh my goodness, I need to have more faith. I can't believe this. God is more amazing than I even gave him credit for. Well, Likaveki was one of the students. Another student was Oveke. Now, Oveke was actually one of the very first converts that they had. And it was an amazing thing that he had even become converted. Because Oveke wasn't just one of the natives who just didn't really know about God and got curious and learned about it. Oveke had grown up in one of the villages under his father, who was a devil priest. His father was a devil priest for one of the largest villages in the area. And his father practiced something called puri-puri. Now, puri-puri is actually a very scary thing in the islands there, because puri-puri can kill you. If you decide you're upset at somebody else and you want them out of your way, maybe you want them killed off so you can have their garden, or maybe you want their wife, or maybe you just don't like them because you think they're mean to you, you can go to the devil priest and say, I want puri-puri put on that man, or on that woman, or on that child. And then the devil priest will go, very good, very good. Just bring me a part of their body. Just bring me like a few hairs or a fingernail. Or if you can just bring maybe a scab from one of their wounds. Bring me any part of their body. And then I will take it and I will make my devil magic on it. And I will put it in a little pouch with some of my special devil charms and their hair or their fingernails or their scab. And then we will go and we'll put it, hide it where they sleep. And then they will die. And do you know that in the islands, amongst the people who believe in puri-puri, if somebody comes up and tells you, I have paid the devil priest to cast puri-puri on you, usually within a couple of days, you die. It's hard to say how many of the times that's just from being so afraid of it, or how many times it's actually working. The devil at work there, and people who believe in devils. But puri-puri is a scary thing in the islands, and many of the students were very nervous about puri-puri. And yet here was Oveke, whose father practiced puri-puri, and Oveke said, I want to believe in Jesus. So Oveke was one of their first converts, and how do you think his father felt about that? Angry, furious. In fact, a couple days after Oveke had announced that he wanted to be baptized, Elwyn found a man sneaking around behind the sleeping building of the Batuna school. There was a man sneaking out there in the dark, and when Elwyn said, hey, who are you? The man scurried off. It probably was his dad, because the following morning, when people went to get up from bed, they went in the room to wake up Oveke because he hadn't gotten up, and he wasn't sleeping, and he wasn't dead, and he wasn't awake. He was having a seizure. A seizure is when your brain sends weird signals to your body and you can't control it, and you just start shaking and trembling. And he couldn't respond to them. He was foaming at the mouth and writhing back and forth. And they called, help, help! And people came running in to try to help. And 3 or 4 of the students, strong boys who were used to working with heavy things, grabbed Oveke, and Oveke just flung them across the room. And that's when they started calling for the teachers to come, because they realized this meant there were demons involved. Oveke had become possessed by a demon, and he was flinging people off of him, foaming at the mouth. And then he began to speak in words that nobody could understand, in a language that nobody had ever heard before. And that's not even the freakiest part, you guys, because then some of the men came up to try to hold him down again, and as they went to grab him, he disappeared. He just disappeared. And they were looking around, where did he go? So they started to leave the room, and suddenly he appeared again, and he was rushing back, going, ah! And they came back and they tried to grab him, and they held him down. He was flinging people around, and after a few minutes, he disappeared again. Then he reappeared, and he disappeared a 3rd time. And by this point, they had called for the teachers, they had called for all the pastors on the mission school, they had called everybody they could, and this guy kept disappearing. He had disappeared 3 times now. When he reappeared the 4th time, the pastors were there, the teachers were there, the students were there, they were all kneeling around the bed. Nobody was trying to grab him anymore because he was just too strong. They were just praying, Lord, please help. We know that this demon is taking control, please help. And it didn't seem to be helping, and finally, Elwyn stood up and just yelled right into Oveke's face, In the name of Jesus, come out! And Elwyn says immediately, Oveke just went still. He opened his eyes, and looked around, and he was fine. He was fine. His mind was there. His body was under his control again. And when they asked him, what happened? What do you remember? Do you remember any of this? He said, yes, I went to Myra. Myra? What? Myra? You mean Myra Plantation? The Myra Plantation? That other business down about 5 miles away from here? He said, I went to Myra 3 times. I went to Myra. There's no way he could have gotten to Myra Plantation 3 times. It's 5 miles away. That's a long walk. But he had disappeared. Oveke went ahead and got baptized. And later on, Elwyn met the plantation manager from Myra Plantation, who told him, hey, do you have a student named Oveke? Yes. You know, a few weeks ago, we were all outside working, and all of a sudden we heard a man screaming in the jungle. And we went over to see who it was. By the time we got there, it was gone. So we started to go back to the garden, and then we started hearing screaming again. We came back again, and this time we saw a boy, thrashing about. And he was yelling in a language we couldn't understand, and then he disappeared. So we started to leave, and then he appeared a 3rd time, and then he just... Oveke had teleported, for lack of a better term. In the middle of all this, when he had been doing this, he had actually shown up at a place 5 miles away, and then back, and forth, and back. This was proof to Elwyn that the demons did have power. If you believed in the puri-puri, it could affect you. If you believed that you could harm someone with it, it could work. And Elwyn realized, this is the power of belief, the power of faith. You have to have your faith in the right thing, in the right person, in the right God. Because your faith does have power. And Elwyn found this out himself because a few months later, Elwyn decided to do an evangelism campaign. Besides Oveke and Likaveki, not many other people had been converted. Only a few of the students wanted to give their hearts to Jesus. And so he decided, we're going to go out into the jungle, to the villages, and do an evangelistic campaign. And we'll go to one village and we'll preach for 3 days, and we'll go to another village and we'll preach for 3 days, and so on. And they had done it for a few villages, and they finally got to one village that was quite large. And Elwyn was leading a group of the students in teaching them how to preach, and he stood up to preach the first sermon. And during the first sermon, he noticed someone sitting at the back. And it was a man who was tall. He had a bone through his nose. He had all sorts of things stuck in his hair. He had tattoos on his skin. And he was just sitting there the whole time looking at him like this. It's hard to tell stories to people if they're looking at you like this the whole time. I'm glad you guys don't do that. You guys give me nice smiles. But who do you think it was? It was Oveke's dad. This was the village where he was the devil priest in charge. And after the meeting, he came up to Elwyn. Elwyn didn't know what he was going to say, but he stood there and he was praying in his heart the whole time. And the man came up to him and said, "You, I cast puri-puri on you, you die." Elwyn said, "Oh, you're going to cast puri-puri on me? On me, huh? So I'm going to die?" "Yes. You die. My devil charm's stronger than your God. You die." Elwyn said, "You know, I heard that in order for your puri-puri to work, it works the best if you have maybe some hairs or some fingernail clippings or a scab. Here," and he pulled out a few of his hairs. "Why don't you add these to your puri-puri? Because my God is stronger than your puri-puri." And the devil priest said, "What? Okay." And he scampered off. And for the rest of that day and the next 2 days, Elwyn preached. And at every meeting, the one sitting in the back was the man, and he had a little bag. And he was sitting there just scowling. And after every meeting, he would come up to Elwyn, and he would come close to him and say, "How you feel?" And Elwyn would say, "Never better." And he would go off. But he was there at every meeting. And at the end of the 3rd day of meetings, 50 people in that village said they wanted to give their hearts to Jesus. And they stood, they raised their hands, and at the back, the devil priest stood up, but he didn't raise his hand. He came right down the middle of the aisle, pushing people aside. And he came right up and he said to Elwyn, devil is not stronger than your God. Your God is stronger than puri-puri. I made strongest puri-puri ever. It should kill you immediately. And your God is stronger. I want to worship that God too. And when he said that, the rest of the village said, we want to worship that God too. And Elwyn was just overjoyed. He was amazed at how God had worked through the situation. And he went home, not home, he went to the hut that he was staying in that night in the village. And he had that little charm bag with him. And he said, you know what, I'm going to be able to show this people and show them how God is stronger than the puri-puri. This is going to be amazing. And he went home, he went into the hut, and he set it down next to his bed. And he lay down. It was dark. He pulled his blanket up. He rested. And he slept until around midnight. He suddenly felt hands around his throat. And we'll find out tomorrow what happens.